Hello and welcome back, of course, to another installment of Beards and Cars Rivals, the series where we take two or more cars and pit them in a head-to-head showdown, but in not so much of an abstract lap time or drag race way, more of a real-world way. If you're potentially going to buy one of these, which one is better suited to you, depending on your needs, your wants, and also to weigh in with some potential advantages or disadvantages to each car that you might not have heard of or been aware of. And although this matchup doesn't seem to be the most obvious, a Super Saloon versus a GT, well, actually in a previous episode we did a similar thing with Jaguar, the XKR versus the XFR, and it ended up being very popular. So clearly it wasn't just me who was torn between them. On this occasion, I actually think there's even more crossover, because these share the same platform, or more accurately, the GranTurismo is based on the Quattroporte. Now, for the sake of clarity, of course, we are basing this mostly on the M139 Quattroporte, so from around 2003 up to 2007-ish for the Duo Select or F1 cars, and then 2008 to 2012 for the ZF facelifts, and then on the GranTurismo side, basically from its inception in 2007 up to around the same point. But you could take it as far as you want, really, on the GranTurismos, because of course they've lasted longer, technically, in their form than the Quattroporte did, which was completely changed for the generation after. And at least as far as my personal recommendation, I would say that the best of either of these cars to go for, certainly for the Quattroportes, is anywhere between 2008 and 2012. These cars share the same engines, Ferrari F136 series motors, they share many of the same transmissions, ZFs, you've got the Sport Shift as well on some of the higher models, and as I said, they are based on the same platform, so even the size isn't that far off. It could seem to be like an open and shut case. Do you want 4 doors or 2? And even though you're not necessarily wrong, there's actually more to it than that, in some interesting ways that you might not have thought of. And in particular, there are 3 key things about each of these cars that I would say are notable. The first notable thing about the Quattroporte is, of course, the most obvious: price. Now, the GranTurismo, even for the equivalent engine and transmission, will almost always cost you more than the equivalent Quattroporte, for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is something we're going to touch on in a second, in my opinion, but it is something to factor in. The fact that entry-level, even, GranTurismo, with maybe even higher mileage, will still set you back about 18,000, more so 20 to 25 realistically. Quattroporte, on the other hand, will, 2 out of my 3 that I had were about 13 to 15,000, and they were great. So a pretty notable advantage on price straight off the bat, and for some people, that could be all the difference you need. Where things get interesting about that, though, is actually there's a switch point between the 2 cars where that value and those prices do a complete 180 between them. See, the Quattroporte is cheaper generally, unless you're talking about the highest models. Then it actually goes the other way around, weirdly enough, because a Quattroporte S or a Quattroporte, especially GTS, will actually cost you more in many cases than a GranTurismo S would, which is initially weird, but I guess it makes sense because you don't see as many Quattroporte GTSs available, making them more desirable and more wanted by a wider variety of potential owners. And the gulf between prices is so much more vast on those top and lower level Quattroportes than it is with GranTurismos. I mean, I'm talking literally like more than double the price in some cases. So like 15 grand for a nice 4.2 facelift, 35 grand plus for a GTS of that same year. Huge difference in price. Whereas with the GranTurismo, sure, you could get a 4.2 GranTurismo for about 20, 25 grand, but then you could get a 4.7S for probably more like 30, 35, sometimes 40. So although, yes, it's similar to the Maserati, it's not as much of a gulf in price. To swing over to the GranTurismo, though, I would say that this one, as vain as it initially seems, is a pretty notable one to remember. And that is the looks. And not just the looks, the road presence, the vibe, or even the personality, you could say, that the appearance of the car gives you. It is notably different. Yes, they are essentially the same thing underneath in many ways, but they really aren't to look at. As great as the Quattroporte looks, it's just a fact that the GranTurismo makes more of an impression. It has more of an exotic, more of a supercar kind of road presence, and I think that's part of the reason why they tend to keep better values. You can't say it's age, you can't say it's mileage, you certainly can't say it's engine or transmission advantages, so the only other logical thing that it could be is the fact that the GranTurismo does look more special. And even for me, who clearly loves the Quattroporte, it's the only model that I've ever owned more than once, there's no question. The GranTurismo is definitely a better looking car. car and certainly makes more of an impression, especially if you have some very tasteful visual upgrades like a skirt kit, for example. It's a stunning looking machine. The next advantage for the Quattroporte is of course the most obvious one of all, probably more so than the price. Well, it's literally in the name. It has the 4 doors. Now this is not, no pun intended, as open and shut as it may seem, because actually we're going to return to the subject of seats, doors and space in just a second. But for now, I will say clearly, when it comes to just access, of course the Quattroporte has an advantage. You can get in the back a lot easier than you can in the GranTurismo, and it also gives it the secondary advantage that the rear seat is more of a conventional seat. So yes, the GranTurismo has 4 seats. We'll touch on that more in a second. The Quattroporte has 5 though. So immediately that's an advantage. But also the rear seat is a lot more useful. The rear seats in the GranTurismo, as you would assume from a GT car, have more of that pod kind of feel. That 2+2 more exotic vibe. Whereas with the Quattroporte, and again this is something I've discussed on the channel before, even if you compare the Quattroporte to the Porsche Panamera and the Aston Martin Rapide, it has such a huge advantage in terms of the rear seat over both of those, that it's one of the best things in its arsenal. It's a proper, full-size, comfortable, spacious rear seat, and clearly they designed that part of the car with VIP use in mind. It is not just a 4-door supercar, which it is. It's definitely intended to be a really nice place to be for people in the back, and that is a great design choice because it gives it such an advantage over not only the GranTurismo but even its best rivals from Porsche and Aston as well. The next thing is something which initially you probably won't think about, and for some of you may think, nah, that's never something I'll think about, but as myself shows, having owned 3 and no longer having a Quattroporte at the moment, resale. It is another thing that you do need to bear in mind. You might not want to, you might not give it much thought, and with many of the vehicles that I've bought, I certainly don't give much thought to resale. Sometimes it's come back to bite me in the ass, but the GranTurismo is definitely easier to move on. Even with the higher prices, it is the more desirable car, and unfortunately, as great as they are, and as ironic as it is given how similar they are underneath, the Quattroporte does have a bit more of a feeling of worry, I think, from many owners. And it comes from those older Duo Select cars, including stories from owners, myself included, that are, rightfully so, pointing out these potential problems. The GranTurismo doesn't tend to have those same horror stories because Maserati, for the most part, had already moved past that and it came with the ZF to begin with. The fact that it has the better looks, that it's the more desirable GT style, well, all of this added together means that even though no Maserati is quote-unquote easy to sell, because many people are just terrified of them, of the two, I would probably take my chances with trying to resell a GranTurismo and making at least some kind of money back, compared to selling a Quattroporte and making money back. So again, for many people, you won't care. You'll intend to buy it, own it, keep it for however long, and that's great. But it is something that you should at least give some thought to, so at least for a car that does cost more, the GranTurismo is more likely to actually sell again relatively quickly if you need to move on from it. Now, the third thing that I want to bring up about the Quattroporte is probably the one which is the least obvious. And it's certainly the least obvious if you haven't driven one, and especially if you haven't driven either of these cars. And this is one of the main reasons I would say, please, if you get the chance, test drive both. Because this is not one that you would ever expect. I've talked about this before on the channel, but it certainly bears repeating again. The handling on the Quattroporte is the best secret weapon in its arsenal. Because as great as the GranTurismo feels to drive, I would say that the GranTurismo drives and feels pretty much how you would expect it to. That doesn't mean it's bad, and it certainly doesn't mean it's underwhelming. It is a very capable, hugely enjoyable GT car that definitely feels more exotic than many other cars in its price range, like a DB7 or an XK. But the Quattroporte feels so radically different to anything you're expecting. It is so completely otherworldly in terms of handling and physics and personality to any other super saloon I've ever driven, including the Rapide, including the Panamera, that it genuinely is one of the most memorable driving experiences you will ever have. To this day, I would put the Quattroporte in my top 5 favourite handling cars I've ever driven, including stuff like 911s and Alfa Quadrifolios. It's legitimately that memorable and that good. Now, some people level the criticism against the Quattroporte that it's a bit too twitchy for them, and that's understandable. The front end is a bit lighter because it's front mid-engine. They basically put the engine as far back behind the dash as it can be to make it as close to being a mid-engine sports car as a 2-ton limo can realistically feel like, but also the fact, and I don't hear many other people talking about this, the fact that the Quattroporte has kind of a wedge-shaped design, where the front end is sloping down and very narrow, and then the back end is taller. Even in terms of headroom, the rear passengers have better headroom than the front, which is a weird idea. Not many cars have that. It's almost like an exaggerated Lancia Stratos kind of shape. And it really works, because not only does it make it great for, again, the rear seat VIPs, but it means that when you're sitting behind the wheel, you can barely see the bonnet. The bonnet just disappears downwards so drastically that it almost feels like the car doesn't have a front end. Probably sounds weird to describe, but what that means in practice, especially in conjunction with the towed-out suspension that they have in terms of alignment, the more rear-biased weight, which is very unusual for a saloon, certainly a 2-ton one that's 17 feet long, and even more so in the Duo Select cars, because they had, of course, the different transmission, but also they had dry sump lubrication, which put even more weight over the back. I think they were like a 53% rear, whereas the ZFs are a 40, or 51, I should say, percent rear, so still rear bias, but not quite as much, is it means that as soon as you start driving, and certainly as soon as you start taking it through corners at any kind of speed, that weight and that size, it just melts away. It immediately turns from being this large, elegant limo, which it is, into genuinely feeling like one of the most nimble sports cars you've ever been in. It has no right to corner and to handle like it does. And even though for some people, I could see them maybe preferring the more traditional, maybe a bit safer feel, the more expected feel of the GranTurismo, if you're looking for something unique, something that really feels special and like nothing else through corners, then the Quattroporte definitely delivers that. And the last thing I want to mention in favour of the GranTurismo actually isn't an advantage of the GranTurismo over the Quattroporte, but it is something which I really think needs to be said, because again, not enough people say this, and not enough people appreciate it, and that is that although the Quattroporte undoubtedly has the better rear space, rear access, rear seat, etc., the GranTurismo legitimately is one of the best GT cars you can buy in terms of rear seat space. And it's because it's based on the Quattroporte platform. Having that extra length and extra space by design already means that you can genuinely fit actual passengers in the back of a GranTurismo, even compared to something which you would think would have way more space, like maybe a Bentley Continental. And it immediately is such a huge advantage over any Aston, pretty much any Jag, to the point where I would actually say that it's probably better to sit in the back of a GranTurismo than it is to even sit in the back of an Aston Martin Rapide. And that's a 4-door. So it really is one of the sleeper best examples of a proper 2+2 GT car. You can genuinely fit in the back seats, and that is something which needs to be stressed. Of course, against the Quattroporte, it doesn't stand a chance for rear seats, but against every other GT car with 2 doors, it's a fantastic advantage to have. Even more so, you could argue, if you go for the Grand Cabrio with the open top. They cost you a little bit more, but the rear space is even better when you've got the roof down as well. So it's a huge advantage for the GranTurismo, not over the Quattroporte, but over other GT cars, and certainly other sports cars. Ultimately, my choice thus far has been 3 Quattroportes, and I will freely admit that the main reason for that was because they're more attainable on price. But if I ever do get another Maserati, it will almost certainly be a GranTurismo, or maybe in my case a Grand Cabrio, which is the one I would probably choose. My recommendation on avoiding Duo Selects hasn't changed, much to the chagrin, of course, of many Duo Select owners who viciously defend their cars, and, more power to you if you love the car and if you've never had any issues, that's great. But they definitely can and often do have their issues, certainly did in my case. With the ZFs, just didn't happen. They can have their own problems, of course. As I said, electrical issues and gremlins tends to be the main thing, and although they can have mechanical problems, as any car can, generally speaking, caring for a GranTurismo is just like caring for a Quattroporte. They are not Italian Jaguars, they are more luxurious Ferraris. so they need to be treated as such. They need to be treated with love, they need to be treated as delicate, handcrafted Italian pieces of art, which is precisely what they are. If you're considering maybe buying a Jaguar or a Lexus or a Maserati, then they're not the car for you. Go for one of those other ones. If, on the other hand, you're the kind of person who loves the idea of a TVR or a Panos or a Maserati, then consider them. They're the kind of car that you buy because you've always wanted one, not because it's just another option. You really do have to love a Maserati and want one, because that is the kind of person who will enjoy it the most. And if you think about it, that's actually not radically different to an Aston Martin. You can make many of those same arguments even there. They're both lovely cars, they have some significant advantages and some more subtle ones over each other, so I hope if nothing else this has helped you a bit more to decide which one you may prefer or which one might be better for you. And of course, check out the other Rivals matches which I've done, and if you are curious to see how these Maseratis compare to more vehicles, I've already pitted the GranTurismo up against the Jag XK. That was a great match. And I may pit the Quattroporte up against a couple of other cars as well, more so in the Super Saloon category. Ultimately though, that's it for my thoughts. Of course, if you've owned one or both of these in the past yourself, feel free to put your thoughts down below, positive or negative, maybe things for other potential owners to look out for, or certain recommendations, and of course, stick around on the channel for more. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.